A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, right? Well, it turns out probably not. Names really do matter, according to our next guest. They have the power to shape us, to ourselves, and to the world. Duana Taha. She is a TV screenwriter and the author of The Name Therapist, and she joins us now to explain what really is in a name. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so psyched about this because I was talking to you in the dressing room and I said, nowhere else except Canada would you have a Namageni Kiwanuka interviewing a Duana Taha.
Isn't it amazing?
Yeah.
That's what's great about Canada, really, is that everything is kind of coming together in Toronto.
And your book is called The Name Therapist. So what does a name therapist do?
Well, I should say there's no degree for name therapy as yet.
Yeah.
But what I learned was that when I spoke to people about names, about baby names initially, about what they were going to choose for their children, inevitably they had feelings about their own names, adults, young adults, people who had changed their names, and they'd never really gotten to talk about them. You know, everybody has a name, but we don't really discuss how you might feel or how it affects you. And so the Name Therapist grew out of all the stories that people told me and all the ways that their names affected their lives, maybe without them realizing.
And who do you think it affects more, like the person, the child, or the parent who does the naming?
Oh, that's interesting. Definitely the child. One of the things I always say is we talk about baby names, but in fact they're not baby names at all. They're names for somebody's entire life. They're people names. And you know, a name that seems cute on a little kid can be odd when you're an adult who needs to be taken seriously, or you know, people often say like, oh, that's a lot of name for a little kid, but they'll enjoy it later. So definitely I think the impact is on the wearer.
And you've had this obsession with names since you were a kid, a small child. Do you think that's helped you as a screenwriter?
Oh, absolutely, I do. Every writer, you know, I think comes to things differently in terms of characterization or the way that they imagine things. But for me, names have always been a really integral part of it. Absolutely. If I know somebody's name, I know so much about them.
And how do you use that when you're writing like a screenplay for TV?
I feel like there is a shorthand for characters. Even if we don't always all know what the same feelings are about a name, you have a feeling. If you name a character Balthazar, for example, you sort of go, okay, well, he's saying Balthazar all the time. It's not shortened. He has a sense of self and of importance. And the people who named him have a sense of not wanting to fit in. It's somebody totally different than if you choose a Kevin or a Nicole. You know, it's a different outlook on the world as a result. And
pop culture plays a big part in this. What role does pop culture play in people giving kids their names?
Oh, well, that's really interesting. So it used to be, you know, remember people used to talk about, oh, Hollywood names, they're so crazy, they're so wacky. But what in fact was happening, sometimes they were offbeat, sometimes they were more ethnically diverse than people were used to hearing in their own neighborhoods. And with the rise of the internet, that sort of has equaled out. There's a lot less, weird and wacky show business and pop culture and normal names, whatever a normal name is. There's a lot more balance between names being given kind of across the board to everybody, and for that cross-pollination of pop culture influences things, but it influences both ways. And pop culture is as likely to be influenced by somebody in Minnesota as vice versa.
And it's interesting to me that now you hear of countries banning certain names. I don't know if that happened before.
I don't know if we heard about it before or if people were so willing to challenge it before. Yeah, there are a lot of countries where you can only choose a name from a fairly lengthy pre-approved list. And it's shocking because the names that are coming up against being a problem, the ones that you're like, are really the furthest reaches of out there. We've heard ones like Lucifer, and we've heard ones about, you know,
like hyphen or something.
Tallulah does the hula in Hawaii was one that came up and was a real, and there are people who are trying to name their kids barcodes and things like that. So it becomes really about the individuality of the parents. It really becomes about them trying to say, look how unique we are and look how unusual we are for choosing this name. But yeah, that there are now sort of governmental boards who think, well, no, that's unacceptable, and you have to sort of choose something that's within the reaches of normalcy.
Because you know, those kids have to live with those names for the rest of their life. And in The Name Therapist, you have a beef with your parents. Because they named you Duana, and you wanted something more, I guess, normal, whatever, like you said, normal is. Where does your name come from?
So the name Duana is, I'm told, a very old Gaelic name that's not in really common usage. And they chose it because I was going to have an Egyptian surname, Taha, and so they wanted to sort of balance the two cultures, which, as we said, a very nice Canadian idea. But it was unheard of in sort of the 1980s when I was growing up. It was sort of so unusual as to be outright weird, outright odd, and that really felt to me at the time like, oh, this is an unusual cross that I'm carrying about. So it was difficult at the time, more than I think they ever thought it would be.
I wanted to read you a passage from your book. And so you write, they say you never get a second chance to make a first impression. But if someone knows your name before meeting you, you've already made an impression. Even though I've been entirely honest about the strife my name caused me, I can't imagine the number of opportunities I might have missed out on if my name were Dana. Often I get calls, professionally or personally, because people read Duana and were generally curious enough to find out what kind of person went with that kind of name. What do people expect from you when they hear your name?
They don't know, and I think that's a real key. People really make judgments about what your ethnicity might be, or what, excuse me, or what your outlook might be, or the kind of person you are if they have an association with your name. The benefit of a name like Duana is that it's so unusual that there's no pre-existing image that goes with it. And so what was a burden when I was younger is now kind of a privilege, I realize, to be able to have it and shape what that impression is.
And it also comes with kind of a burden because now your Googleability, if you do anything, everybody knows it.
It's always me.
To what extent is a person's name intertwined with their personality, like their personality?
I really think it is. You know, there's obviously lots of people love to debate this and say, oh, well, they can't all be. But I think that if you have a name that is fairly common, you sort of go, well, am I like all the other Melanies? Are all the other Melanies, do they share traits? And if they do, am I one of them or am I not? Am I going to sort of make a left turn against those traits? I was so fascinated by that I investigated all the Jennifers that I could find to see whether or not they actually shared anything. But I think even that
Why
feeling...
Jennifer, sorry?
Jennifer, being the most popular name in North America and lots of parts of sort of the British Isles in the 70s and 80s, was the number one name across the board, dwarfed every other popular name. And when I was young, I thought, oh, they're part of a club. They're part of such an amazing, exclusive group of Jennifers who just know that they fit in. So as an adult in the book, I decided to poll all the Jennifers I could find and reach out to see whether they had similar feelings on the name or whether the popularity had any sort of negative effects.
And what did you find? Are they similar? Are they different?
They have a lot of similar outlooks. They do. Many of the Jennifers were not as aware of the popularity of it until they were older, which I found really interesting, that even when it's happening to you, you don't know that. But definitely I was interested in the ways that the burden of proof, as you say, in terms of being the only one versus the arguable burden of being one of the crowd, and whether you are like a Jennifer or not affects you. So I think there's definitely a way that your name influences the personality.
I want to play you a clip. This is a Canadian Heritage Minute called Orphans, where a group of Irish children are being introduced to their new foster families in 1850s Quebec.
Molly Johnson.
In the 1850s, many Quebec families adopted Irish orphans, their parents dead of ship's fever on the Atlantic crossing.
Alors Molly, voici ton nouveau père et ta nouvelle mère. Dorénavant, tu porteras le nom fier et historique de Bélanger. Tu es maintenant une petite Canadienne, Molly.
No, we have to keep our Irish name. Mon mère me l'a dit juste avant le serment. We have to pour la mémoire de mon patrie.
Ça, monseigneur, ça me paraît tout à fait acceptable.
Quel est ton nom, mon enfant?
Johnson, Sir Molly Johnson.
Et comment t'appelles-tu, toi?
Patrick. Patrick O'Neill.
Et toi?
Caitlyn Ryan.
Bien, bien.
A century and a half later, many of those names still resound in Quebec.
I don't know why I always get teary when I watch those
I
things.
was absolutely getting all emotional there. Yeah.
So do names actually mean something?
Well, I think that they do. You know, first of all, people assign them all kinds of meaning. People talk a lot about using family names as a way to remember people who have gone before. They sort of transfer the name onto a child. And in that way, of course, they're not just remembering the person because of the name, they're also thinking that they want to transfer some of the personality of that person, some of the feelings that that person had onto the younger child. So I really think that they mean something according to what we give them, of course. And in the case of surnames and so forth, that's why we have them, to sort of say, well, I belong to this family, I'm a part of this group, whatever that family or group or family structure might mean in the bigger sense. It's a sense of identification and of belonging.
I never thought about it that way, because we all have like a first and a middle and a last name. Do you have any idea where that comes from?
Well, I think there's real biblical sort of influences. I always think about when I learned in OAC history that.
Oh, we're the same age then. Because even now when you say OAC, people are like, oh, I know what year.
Pinpointed.
Yeah.
I always think about the name of Jesus Christ in his actual form was Joshua Bar Joseph Ben David, which means Joshua, son of Joseph, house of David. So, for example, that's a way that those sort of structures come into being, you know, meaning that, well, he's the son of Joseph, the middle name there, and then the house of David, that kind of thing. I really chose to focus on given names in the book because surnames are, as we know, inherited and can be changed, or in the case of the Heritage Minute, can be kind of co-opted and manipulated, and we've heard lots of those stories. But the choice of a first name is new with every new child, with every new generation, and the fact that somebody else is choosing the label that you present to the world was really fascinating to me.
It's like a new beginning every time when you have a child.
Yeah, which it is,
Yes.
absolutely, yeah.
You also, when I was growing up, I always got, you know, your name is so exotic. What do you think about that? Exotic.
Yeah, well, I mean, exotic is, first of all, it's one of those words that we know there's so much behind it, right? Exotic, it means not from here. It means not typical. It means not usual. I know that it's used as a compliment often. Oh, I've never heard that before. But of course, it also means you are
Other.
You are unusual. You are not like us. And so I find it to be, it's tricky with things like that. Of course, I've heard the same thing, and you know, you can see the beauty in, oh yeah, sure, I like my name. It does sound unusual or lyrical, or you know, in a way that maybe some North American names that we're more used to hearing don't necessarily. But what it often means, yeah, is, well, it doesn't sound usual. I get a lot of people saying to me, oh, I wouldn't want for my child to have a name that would be made fun of in the schoolyard. And aside from names that rhyme with certain things, I think that's a relic of the past, I hope, because...
So you don't think like if a child was named Rupinda, they would be treated differently than another kid who might be named John?
I mean, I hope not in 2016. I hope that kids don't know the difference. Kids don't know that Rupinda is any different than Rebecca. What makes one normal and the other one not normal? Usually it's adults telling them. And that's what I found, that usually it was the adults who sort of said, Duana, what does that mean? Certainly when you're young. I don't know if you had kind of the same experience.
Same, and I've had people, like young kids, come up to me and say, hi, I'm Genny, and I'm like, wow, you said that perfectly. But I have, you know, people who are older, and I do the same thing. It's like your brain, you're told not to be able to pronounce certain things, or that's different. I'm like, my name is different. But small kids can come up to me and they say it perfectly, no problem.
Because they're not thinking of like, oh, that's unusual. Maybe even before they, you know, learn to read and sort of structures in English language. But yeah, I really think the idea that, again, you know, I don't think that you want to be naming your child Lucifer. Like, I think that is still...
Oh, Damien, like name that you like.
I want to come back to Damien. I believe it can happen. But yeah, I don't think that a supposed ethnic name or exotic name is any sort of albatross. I hope not. I really hope not.
You also write about names like Shaniqua, Moesha. People term those names as African American names. What did you learn about where those names came from?
So what I learned, which I thought was really interesting, was that the structure of certain African dialects means that small syllables have meaning. So, for example, I remember the name Nisha. In terms of its two syllables, ni and sha might mean, for example, new day. And I want to,
That's pretty.
Correct that kind of thing. And then so what happened as some of those names came to North America is that people who knew those languages and knew those syllables would add more syllables to mean new words. So for example, and again, this I want to make sure that I'm saying the right thing, but for example, if you said Tanisha, it might be beautiful new day. And so some of those names that seem to be to the to somebody who's not familiar to them to be like, oh, well, it's just their syllables. There's so many syllables strung together. In theory, they have a structure that creates meaning, which is why they're given. Having said that, there are lots of names, according to one of my sources, that are created without, you can't necessarily mash together the syllables in that way. The language doesn't work that way, but that they are much maligned because people don't understand them.
And some people, I think, I've heard this conversation with some of my other friends who said that it's cultural appropriation. They're taking an African name and then they're making it into something else. And do you think that debate can go into the naming realm? The debate of cultural appropriation?
Yeah, well, that's really, really interesting because, you know, on the one hand, I can see that argument that it's cultural appropriation. On the other hand, as we all become sort of much more global citizens and more mosaic-y, who decides who's entitled to what name? You know, I really think about that a lot, that there are a lot of people who say, well, people come to me all the time and say, I have Dutch heritage and my partner's is Sri Lankan and, you know, we live in Winnipeg. What do we choose? A name that will work in all the places and be able to be spoken by the grandparents who don't necessarily have a facility with English. So it's one of those ongoing debates of, yeah, can you choose a name that doesn't belong to your culture because you think it's beautiful? Having said that, does it have to be a name that speaks to your culture? I mean, I think that those walls are breaking down. I think that lots of people choose supposedly, you know, traditional names that were British or French who don't have any British or French in them. So
I was going to bring that up because I know a lot of Black Johns, a lot of Black Jameses, and I guess you could argue it goes back to the Bible, but what would you think of like a white couple who named their child Muhammad?
I mean, it's really interesting, right? Like I guess you wonder where it comes from. And one of the things that I think with naming is I've always said, our previous discussion about sort of the names that mean something aside, that it doesn't really matter what the book says the name means. It matters whether it means something to you. So if that couple has an association with Muhammad, if they have a real, there's a real reason why they love the name and choose it, absolutely. I don't know why we should restrict it. If, as it sometimes tends to feel, there's some cultural tourism involved, then it can get a little bit trickier.
What about people who have like names like Katrina or Isis? Your name was, you know, beautiful one day and then it becomes infamous. How do you tell people, what do you tell people how to deal with that?
It's so interesting because this is a modern problem. This didn't used to be the thing, but I've heard from a lot of Katrinas who suddenly say, I got a lot of kind of unwanted attention. And in the case of ISIS, I don't know why, but there must have been a baby boom of ISISes about a dozen or so years ago, because I often get letters from mothers whose now ISISes are little girls and are getting all these sort of comments about, oh, well, that's an unfortunate name. So it's really tricky. If you're an adult, get out in front of it. If it's the one guy in your office who can't stop making the comments, you have to kind of say, yeah, I heard that joke on the subway, and I heard that one too, and yeah, heard that one last night. You got to come up with something new because I'm not there. If it's a child, I think it's really on adults to adults again to kind of say, you know, it's really hard, and would you mind kind of taking it easy because she's being bombarded with.
Do you think they
all
should
this
change their
information.
name?
I don't.
Yeah.
I hope I will not live to regret that statement, but I think if you change your name based on what somebody else thinks of it or what it's associated with, you're kind of giving away a part of your identity, which is really tricky. And I spoke to lots of people who changed their names by choice, and even the people who wanted to get rid of the names they'd been given at birth for various reasons have kind of mixed feelings about going away from it. So I think you'd really feel lost if you gave up your name.
Probably like a death,
I think so. Yeah, I think in lots of ways. In fact, that's an interesting term because when you speak to trans individuals who change their names, they often refer to the names they were given at birth as dead names. That's
Really?
the expression. Yeah.
We have an image of Bruce, now Caitlyn Jenner. How do trans people come up with how they change their name?
It really varies, and I don't want to speak for the entire trans community, of course, but people that I spoke to often wanted to find something that maybe had a link, maybe an initial or something to the name that they had worn in their previous lives. Some people that I spoke to chose a name that their parents might have chosen for them if they had been born, the gender that they felt they should have been born. And in the case of Caitlyn Jenner, it's I really am amused by the name because, of course, Caitlyn is
a new name.
It's a much newer name. It's an old Irish name in a way, but it's a much, much newer name than Bruce, and it's of a different generation. And so what it kind of says to me, and I don't know if this was Caitlyn Jenner's intention, is, well, I'm kind of, not only am I reborn, but I am much younger. I'm able to go back and kind of live my life again as a younger person. So I kind of think it's a really inspired choice. It wasn't what I was expecting at all.
It's a great name.
Yeah.
You have a chapter in the book about stripper names.
Yeah.
Candy, Crystal, Brandy. How do you think certain names become associated with a particular profession?
Well, I don't think it's fair, first of all. There are studies that were done in Freakonomics and other sort of name research books that talk about the ways that names sort of work their way through the social classes, that there are names that are chosen initially by sort of very well-read, high-class parents that then become hugely popular because they feel new, because they feel interesting, and work their way sort of through the strata, which is interesting. In the case of the names like Crystal or Amber, those names that we often think of stereotypically, Bunny, they're often objects. They are, there's no such thing as a Samantha, but there is such a thing as a champagne or a diamond, those kinds of things. And the idea that those names are applied to women who are involved in a profession that sometimes says, see women as objects. Yeah, exactly. That was a real revelation for me.
When I was reading that, I was like, wow, I never thought of it that way. Do you think that just happened organically, or it was kind of like, how is it that most of these names that we associate with strippers are objects?
I mean, I think they're also often names that are associated with luxury. And so I think that's sort of where it begins. Again, if you choose, a very upper crust name like Sloan is one that was very sort of Sloany, you're not saying overtly, oh, well, this name is entitled to all of these things. Choosing a name like Candy is almost saying, well, this person is as sweet as, is as, Crystal, is as sort of luxurious as. So I think it's one of those questions of, if you have to say it, then maybe you are not it, and then you're drawing lines between socioeconomic status and careers in sort of stripping or other sort of adult entertainment kind of environments, and that's a little tenuous, and I don't think it's true across the board, but I think that's where the association comes from. The idea that you're trying to acquire a little bit of luxury through a name is one of those things that doesn't necessarily happen to, say, the royal family.
And what would you say when someone's trying to come up with a name, like parents are trying to come up with a name? What are some of the things that they should consider? I know you get paid to do this, but
I'm delighted to talk about it all the time. I think a lot of parents, first of all, really get focused on a baby, and of course, as you should, but also think about the adult who's going to wear the name. A lot of parents get upset about nicknames. Oh, I don't want them to be called nicknames. I don't like Nam, for example, whatever it is. But you have to be okay with all the various names that could be derived from your child's name, because even if you don't choose them, their friends or their sports team or whatever it is are going to find a way to talk about those. So definitely those are big things there. And then parents are more obsessed with originality than they ever have been. And so I think that often they don't realize they're choosing a name that's more popular than they think. So I'm always thinking, like, go to Starbucks, and when the kid is making a mess in the corner, what is the mother saying? Jaden, stop it. There might be a lot of Jadens then, if that's the case. Like, listen for the names that you're hearing to make sure you're not accidentally replicating something that's too popular.
I love that Utah chapter, by the way.
I was so surprised by the Utah chapter, the women who kind of spoofed Utah names, as they're called, which are so unusual and unheard of outside Utah. I was shocked and amazed by it. Yeah, that there are all these names that who knew that people were calling their children Rev and Racer.
And there's a rhyme or reason to why they do it.
In theory, yeah there is. And, you know, and it talks about the structure of the huge families and all the sort of naming traditions that they have when they often have many children. But fascinating, yeah.
I could talk to you for another half an hour, and I wish I met you 3 years ago before I named my daughter. We'll talk about that afterwards.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.